Шановні гості, другий день третього українського жіночого конгресу.
Ukrainian Women's Congress is open. Let me welcome all of the participants and please attention to the screen. Can you imagine the government of the European country which has no women in it? It's Ukraine a decade ago, and today 1/3 of government are women. Can you imagine the government where women dominate? It's Sweden 2014, Spain since 2018. In 2016, the US doesn't have any limitation for the combat connected positions. Can you imagine European country where the military service is mandatory? This is Norway since 2014. Out of 1,800,000 of people, there are women. The world and Ukraine together will never be the same. And the change, the driving force behind this change, this is the thinking of a new generation. And today we start with discussing national peculiarities of gender politics in different countries, and the moderator for this platform is Ambassador Extraordinary of Plenipotentiary of Ukraine, Ms. Lana Zerkal. And we are welcoming the speakers, Melinda Simmons, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of UK in Ukraine, Anka Feldhusen, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Federal Republic of Germany to Ukraine, Tobias Tyberg, Ambassador of Sweden to Ukraine, Bartosz Cichocki, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Poland to Ukraine, Larisa Haladza, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Canada to Ukraine, Kaivi Laine, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of Finland to Ukraine, Melena Kuneva, the head of the representation of the EU at the Council of Europe, Etienne de Poncen, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary on France to Ukraine, Christina Aquin, the Vice Head of Mission of the US Embassy in Ukraine. Ms. Zerkal, now you have the floor. Good morning, everybody, and now I would like to switch to English because my honorable and distinguished guests, all of them, they use English as their common language, so I have the offer to those people who cannot use English, please use the headsets, and I would like to welcome everybody here. This is the second day of this extremely important and unusual Congress, because this Congress is very important for Ukraine, and for the third time that the ladies are organizing it. This is for Ukraine very big achievement, as you've observed those on the screen.
Distinguished panel, I am pleased to invite all of you here today in Kyiv, and I am very happy that you were able to join us and to present your experience, because experience of your countries is very relevant for Ukraine. And today I made some researches and would like to start with some numbers, as well as we just saw on the screens. I had an opportunity to find very interesting data which was published just recently in October by the European Institute for Gender Equality. And this Gender Equality Institute made some indexes for European Union countries. And it's interesting that in 2019, the index score for the EU in general is 67.4. And among member states, the leading position, of course, has Sweden. The second country among these panelists is Great Britain. Sweden has 83.6, Great Britain 75.3, France 74.6, Finland 73.4, Germany 66.9, and Poland 59.9. The lowest rate and the lowest score in the European Union has what country? Greece and Hungary. And I would like today to talk about these country specificities. Why? Why we have such a difference even among European Union countries? Why not all of them pay much attention to the issues which were scored by the European Institute of Gender Equality? And there were a few topics where they scored the progress and the attitude towards equality. Those topics are work, money, knowledge, time, power, health, and violence. And this year, the report was also devoted to the work-life balance. And I would like us also to talk about the possibilities for women to join work and family life. Because in Ukraine, it is still an issue. And being a deputy foreign minister, I must confess that I saw a lot of bright women, but they had a very difficult choice. They had to choose between work and family lives. I also had a possibility to look on numbers in the ministry, where we were 5 years ago and where are we now. And those numbers are not very impressive. I was surprised because I definitely thought that we made a more significant progress. Unfortunately not. However, if we compare the results of 2013, where it was only 1% of women on the leading posts in the ministry, now we have around 8. But it's only 8% of women on the positions of the heads of unions and heads of departments, not more. With our ambassadors, the situation even worsened, but I don't want to take your attention more, and I would like to come back to our panelists. And I would like to start with the winner of this course, with the Sweden. I think that we need to have more information about the progress Sweden made during the last decades. And the highest score Sweden has in healthcare, 94.7. And the greatest improvement in the domain of power, plus 9.3 since 2005. And in a point of power, in the domain of power, Sweden has 83.4 score. That's the highest in the EU. And I would like also to add that women ministers in 2018 were 52%, and MPs, members of the parliament, 47%. And with this, I would like to pass the floor to Your Excellency and ask you to provide us more information concerning the results of such work, great work, and your experience and your advices to Ukraine.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Lana, and thank you so much for having me on this panel today. the Swedish feminist government basically set out identifying three things to focus on: rights, resources, and representation. Equal rights for women and men in all domains, equal representation, political representation primarily, but we also strive towards equal representation in business and other spheres of life, and equal resources. And as you said, you know, Sweden has done a lot in recent years and decades, but we're still far from being a country where men and women enjoy equal rights, representation, and resources. And I think that's why it is so important for Sweden to have a feminist government which continues to strive for full equality, which is something we certainly have not achieved in my country, not yet anyway. I'd like to focus today on three things which we believe could be interesting from our experience, and which are three things that we work closely with our Ukrainian partners on, because they come specifically to these issues of rights, resources, and representation. And maybe specifically I'll be focusing today on resources. The first issue is gender budgeting. It's something we've been working on in Sweden for, I think, 10, 15 years. And what it means is essentially that when you get down into the nitty-gritty of planning how the state is going to use and distribute the resources that it has at its disposal, any such decision from the very beginning, from the very moment the work starts in the ministries and in the government agencies providing input to the lawmakers for their final decision on the budget, has to be analyzed from the point of view what are the specific needs of women and men in this sphere, and how will this specific allocation of resources affect women and men in different ways. And it took a long time for that process because it's cumbersome. It forced people to change the way they think. It forced our statistical agency to do a huge work in terms of disaggregating data which is available about the society and which lawmakers need in order to make a budget. So it really was a way of gearing the entire machinery of the state towards a new way of working with arguably the most central document of any state when it comes to distribution of resources, namely the state budget. And it took a long time. There was political opposition, there was bureaucratic inertia, and there was basically incompetence in terms of how we do these things, and it took Sweden very many years to reach a point where gender budgeting came naturally to us. And when I speak to my colleagues at the Ministry of Finance back home in Sweden, they tell me that we're now beginning to see the benefits. And this is something which has not only benefited women in Sweden, it's something which has also benefited Sweden as a whole, because using public resources in a way which most directly meets the needs of citizens is a more effective way of using public resources. So this has been something which has benefited the entire Swedish economy and something that has been very important to us. Now, why do I mention this? Well, first of all, we've been working very much with this on this issue with the Ministry of Finance, with Minister Makarova in recent years, and it's been producing great results. And I think for Sweden, sort of my first recommendation on this issue would be that in the budget code of Ukraine, lawmakers make sure to make amendments which institutionalize gender budgeting, because until this is properly instituted in the laws, in the regulations which determine how the budget is carried out, there is a risk that it won't be permanent. So that would be sort of my first the first experience from the Swedish past that I'd like to point to, which might be of interest and use to Ukraine. The second issue comes to process, and it's about this very vague term called gender mainstreaming. It's a word, I think, which raises maybe more questions than answers because it is vague. And I think in our experience it has proven to be very important to become concrete as quickly as we can in terms of what we mean by gender mainstreaming. And one of those things, for instance, is that any bill discussed in the government and the cabinet of ministers needs to be analyzed from the point of view of its effect on men and women from the very start, rather than that being an afterthought which comes in at the end of the process. Because once you're at the end of the process, once the whole cabinet of ministers is all sitting with a paper in front of them, then somebody comes up and says, oh, by the way, there's going to be some adverse effects here, or we might not have considered the effects on women and men of this particular proposal. We all know it's a hell of a job to begin the whole circle again. And then you go back to the ministries and the agencies and everybody has to start working again. So that would be sort of my second, the second Swedish experience, which I think might be of interest for Ukraine, is how do we work gender mainstreaming into the process of creating bills and regulations, the nuts and bolts of the work of the government. The third and the final point I wanted to make is maybe one which is somewhat more aspirational in the case of Ukraine, but it has to do with issues of parental leave and the rights of parents. In our experience, it is crucial for equality between women and men that the rights that parents be treated equally, not as mother and father, but as simply two parents when it comes to decisions relating to the home and to the state. Now, there are, of course, issues here which are not the responsibility of the state, which are the responsibility of the parents and the family, but there are certain things which the state can do. One of those is to ensure that parental benefits apply equally to the father and the mother. And in our experience, in the Swedish experience, although that has sometimes been criticized from a budget point of view because it costs a lot of money to have generous equal benefits for mothers and fathers, over time it has been a huge boost to the Swedish economy, as proven by statistics, for instance, that show that Sweden has the highest rate of working mothers and the highest rate of working women. And I'm also glad to be able to say that we have seen no adverse effects on the socio-economic or moral state of Swedish children. So nobody has had to suffer because Swedish women have been given opportunities to take part in the workforce on this equal conditions as men. I leave it at that, but those would be three things from the Swedish experience. Thank you so much, Lana.
Thank you. And I think that Swedish experience is very relevant for Ukraine, especially concerning the parental leaving. And definitely we have this problem in Ukraine when we have to choose whether to stay at home with our children or to continue our careers. And here I also think that this gender budgeting is one of the very important and crucial things, because definitely that's the future of any kind of gender policy. And here I would like to mention that only 17 OECD countries introduced gender budgeting, and among them is Canada. And Canada is also famous with its analysis of gender policy, which became a routine of any government in Canada. And I would like to pass the floor to Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, to present your experience to the audience.
Thank you very much. And I have a little less to say because Tobias has done such a great job of explaining what gender budgeting is. But let me just start for a moment with some context, the Canadian context, and why work on gender equality is still really important for a country like Canada. In Canada, women still are at high risk of gender-based violence and domestic violence, and approximately every 6 days, one woman is killed by her intimate partner. Violent crime overall is declining in Canada, but not sexual assault. And 90% of victims of sexual assault in Canada are women. We see increases in the rate of online hate, which we see as an extension of violence against women, and 70% of those victims are women. On the economic side, women in Canada earn 84 cents for every dollar that men make. They are 60% less likely to go from being a director in a company to a vice president, so go from manager to senior executive. and they still do 64% of the unpaid work around the house. So that's the Canadian context for continuing to want to work harder. And today, Canada's government is known as a feminist government, but actually, I think it's important to recognize that our march towards the progress that has been seen in Canada actually started a long time ago. In the 1970s, the government created a Minister for the Status of Women. In the 1980s, in addition to ratifying CEDAW, equality rights were enshrined in the Constitution. In the 1990s, we started this habit of gender-based analysis, and in the 2000s, a parliamentary committee was created to oversee and examine women's issues. So these are just some examples of the progress that was made over time. To speak about gender budgeting specifically, like I said, it started in the 1990s, and it's about preparing and analyzing budgets from a gender perspective. Both how do the budget proposals that are being put forward affect men and women differently, and also, overall, how does the budget invest in gender equality? Most recently, some advancements that were brought and progress brought to the process of gender-based budgeting are as follows. First of all, we went from gender-based analysis to what we call GBA+. We said we can't just look at how our initiatives are different, affect women and men differently, because that assumes that all men are the same and all women are the same, and we know that they're not. So this analysis is now required for all proposals. How does it affect women versus men? How does this affect younger people versus older people? How does it affect mentally disabled people, physically challenged people, urban versus rural, Indigenous, and so on? So there are two blocks. That's the first block. Gender-based analysis plus looks at how Canadians are going to be affected. So when you have a tax cut, an investment in cancer research, a peacekeeping mission that you're going to fund, or a social investment, social housing investment, we want to know who benefits and what might be the unintended consequences. There are some challenges in doing gender budgeting, and probably the biggest one is data, the availability of data. Luckily, we have a strong census, we have Statistics Canada, we have good tax modeling that helps us predict the impacts of any given initiative. And we try to look at those elements of the gender-based analysis plus that are most relevant to that budget initiative. Another challenge is the quality of the analysis, and this gets to people and the analysts and the amount of effort that they put into it, and is the overcoming the bureaucratic inertia that Tobias spoke about. And in this regard, it's very important to insist, to have champions, to train, to have tools. And that's what we've seen as important in making the progress and in making gender-based budgeting and GBA plus analysis a part of every person's job. It's not siloed in some part of the department. It's not an afterthought. It is something that we must internalize and think about from the beginning. So that's the first block. The second block of gender-based of gender budgeting looks at what explicit investments must be made or what spending will happen to address gender inequality as it exists in our society and in our programs. And the very foundation of our ability to do this is a gender results framework. It sets out what Canada should be aiming for. It helps identify to the political decision makers what can be done. And in fact, it is used by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance. They put it in front of them and they look and they do their analysis based on that framework. It was developed and used for the first time in 2018. And at the very top of that framework, you can find it online. It says, Canada is aiming for Canada's economic future depends on people having equal opportunity to reach their full potential regardless of gender. And when that's at the top, and that's what you're thinking about when you're preparing your annual budget, it really allows you to put the spotlight on what you are doing, what you're not doing, and what more you might need to do. So that was mapped out. It elevated the priority of some initiatives that could drive gender equality, and it showed what more could be done. For example, this specific analysis, this gender results framework, led to an initiative to introduce 5 weeks of leave, of paternity leave, for a second parent, generally a father. The idea being, the evidence showing that a father's engagement in an infant's life early on, with about 5 weeks of intensity, leads to better outcomes and longer-term engagement in the upbringing of that child and the sharing and the responsibilities for that. So 5 weeks of additional leave provided for fathers. They could take it, they could leave it. The rest of our parental leave can be shared however a mother or however parents choose, but this is just for the second parent, and that came out of the gender budgeting process. Taking it even further, in 2018, the government created legislation making gender budgeting mandatory and making it mandatory to publish all the information on the gender and diversity impacts of new initiatives announced in the budget. This brings a new level of transparency to the analysis that goes into gender budgeting, and is an important indicator of the importance of gender analysis. I would say that success of gender budgeting is the tools that we give people, getting analysts excited and making sure they understand that it's part of everyone's job, and most importantly, the political imperative and the drive to do it properly and thoroughly and consistently.
And I would like just to add that among panelists are Finland and Germany, who are also introduced gender budgeting in their policies. But now I would like to pass the floor to Poland. We have quite similar societies with most of the similar views, quite conservative, and not surprisingly, Poland has only 55.2 scores of 100 and ranks 24th in the EU in gender equality index. The gender inequalities are the most pronounced in the domain of power, only 29.1. And that's one of the lowest in the EU. Can you elaborate a little bit more? Why? What are the reasons? What causes such a low representation of women in the power institutions? Because we, I think, have similar problems and similar conservative approaches to this treatment of women.
Thank you, Ambassador. Ladies and gentlemen. First, thank you for having me. I don't know exactly the methodology of this report you are quoting. I'm not challenging it, but it's difficult for me to elaborate of what I'm not familiar with. But first, we in Poland very much look forward to see Ukraine on those EU statistics and records. We look forward both for Ukrainian men and Ukrainian women in the EU family, even if some studies are painful and expose you to criticism. In fact, we believe we are quite successful within the recent years in enhancing opportunities for women and equaling their position in economy, society, or politics. Starting with the power, I think we are doing quite well with 3 prime ministers, women, Hanna Suchocka, Beata Szydło, Ewa Kopacz. Today, the elected in mid-October parliament consists of in 30% of women. The speaker of the same is a lady. Well, it's it's a beginning.
I'm actually asking about why do you think women are not highly represented in the government or in the parliament? Because yes, you are absolutely right that the data increased in comparison to 2011, but still it's too low in comparison with other member states.
Well, we are working on this, and I think we are doing better and better. We'll see next year and next year. In the economic bloc, for example, in the government is almost fully feminized. Jadwiga Emilewicz, now Minister Jedynak, ladies rule the money, which is the right thing, I guess, at least in our context, cultural, historical. This government runs a policy we call a freedom and choice policy. It begins with family-devoted, committed policies. Since 2016, every family that has more than one kid receives monthly support of well over 100 euro monthly. This year it was enhanced to every child. So even if you have one child, you receive this family support. And we discovered it hugely increased women's choice whether to stay in the labor market or devote to their time to the families or join those two, like to take a half-time job to continue career, but at the same time spend time with the family. Of course, for many years we have paternity leaves, so also fathers, not in my time unfortunately, but fathers also take paternity leaves to help mothers come back to the labor market earlier. Maternity leave is for 12 months currently. Of course, we have a whole set of parameters, legal parameters that protect women in the labor when you are pregnant or during your maternity leave. Nobody can kind of move you out of the job. Within the health system, which is, I think, one of the crucial to when we talk about gender equality and opportunities for women, maternity wards are believed to be the most successful in our system, in modernization, in re-equipment, in introducing new technologies and best practices. So it is part of this freedom and choice policy to help women.
We always also have very good approach to the maternity leave, but it didn't help us to ensure participation of women in the power and in everyday business lives and representation of women in the leading bodies of the companies. And now I would like to ask you, Melinda, what do you think? According to the experience of the United Kingdom, you have very good scores in gender equality and special policies. And what kind of experience you might share with us according to your particular experience as a foreign service person?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Lana, very much. So I think just really briefly, domestically, it mirrors actually Sweden and Canada's experience, leaving aside the gender budgeting, the issue of making sure that resources were available for women to be able to make choices about the kind of work they wanted to do, and that's particularly got better around digital economy. The assumption of rights is something that has been really big in the UK for at least the last 30 years, but mostly it's been about the inspiring stories and people seeing British women step up and take up roles, even where the perceptions are that it's difficult to do them. Personally, in the last 3 years, I've never been more inspired than by our own female parliamentarians, for example, who, and this is a matter of record, it's a matter of research, that the majority of British parliamentarians who receive online abuse are female parliamentarians. Very few of them have quit politics as a result. Instead, they have set up different forms of support mechanisms, different forms of relationships in order to help themselves to manage and tackle that abuse, and it's inspiring. As for our role in foreign policy around gender, and I'll just speak on this really briefly. Everybody has started with a killer statistic, And I have one which dictates the reason really why I'm involved in this work and have been for a very long time. And that is the statistic that in the world, globally, 1 in 3 women either have experienced or will experience violence or sexual violence. 1 in 3. That's 818 million women. That is one of the most systematic violations of rights ever, anywhere, and it just should not be. And this is an attitude that I think was most interesting in that it was a male Foreign Secretary, William Hague, who took it up and partnered with Angelina Jolie, a globally known Hollywood actor, to create the Preventing Sexual Violence campaign. And what's very well known about that campaign is that it broke the taboo of being able to talk about sexual violence not as a byproduct, a thing you had to live with when war happened, but something that was central to it and should be prosecutable for it. What's less well known is how much the UK learned about itself and about its own view of gender equality as a result of being involved in that campaign. And there were 2 things I think we learned. One was that we came round to not just talking about protection of women, but the participation of women. Participation of women in peace processes, participation of women in the economy when building a strong and independent state, something that I think is hugely important for Ukraine. It's well known and researched that nearly 90% of peace agreements fail because women haven't been part of the process. And why do they need to be part of the process? Because their very experience of war is a form of intelligence that you have to take account of if you want a peace process to be sustainable. And because women suffer injustices, of which sexual violence is one, where if you want to achieve lasting justice in a conflict and you don't know about the experience of women, you can't achieve a lasting justice, and that festers and it undermines your peace agreement. But mostly because many women find their vocation in activism. They become involved, as they have done in Ukraine, in peace building, in demining, in forming civil society groups. And these are things that we have come round as the UK to championing much more proactively in recent years. Very, very briefly in 2 ways. One, by passing a law, making it mandatory for us to consider in all of our development programming the impact on women and girls and men and boys. This speaks to Larissa's point about it's now everybody's job who's involved in foreign policy to think about the impact of what we do on women and girls and men and boys. And the other has been our appointment of Joanna Roper, our Special Envoy for Gender Equality, who has made it her role, her life's work, to ensure that beyond the law, everybody in every part of UK government is thinking about gender equality when thinking about what they do overseas.
And with this, I would like to pass the floor to France and to ask you about your experience, because France introduced legislative quotas in 2000. And since that time, you considerably increased the representation of women in power. And now you have 50% of women ministers and 37% of members of the parliament. And you also introduce 40% quotas for company boards and increased representation of women since 2005 to 44%.
Yes, thank you very much, Mrs. Minister. I was myself impressed by the statistics that you have mentioned, and I did not know that we were so well ranked in that index. So thank you for that. That's a good surprise of the day. But that's demonstrate, because you have also mentioned the legislation, French legislation that has been passed on the last years, and that demonstrates that an affirmative action is successful on a mid-term or long-term perspective. And it is true that our French politicians have made of gender equality one of their main objectives. And to give you an example, French President Emmanuel Macron has decided when he entered into office that gender equality will be the grande cause nationale, the great national cause of his mandate, his current mandate. And this is something of significance. We have got good result. You have mentioned also the diplomacy and the ambassadorial posting. Now we have 30% of women as a French ambassador, which is something also important. And I would like also to insist on a new step of our policy, which is the launching of a gender diplomacy. Now it's part of our priority in France. It's, for example, it's part of my roadmap as a French ambassador here in Ukraine to foster gender equality in this country. You know that for the year, during this year, we are chairing the G7 group, and you may know that at Biarritz, during the last G7 summit, we have adopted an important declaration on gender equality and women's empowerment, and it's my pleasure to officially hand over to you. This G7 declaration is open, of course, for every state in the world to join. And I was very happy to hear that during the opening session of your Congress, the First Lady, Mrs. Olena Zelenska, has publicly announced that Ukraine will join this G7 Biarritz Declaration, G7 partnership. And Deputy Prime Minister Kuleba will be in Paris next week. He's in charge of gender equality. And he told me that he will formally hand over an official letter to his counterparts to publicly declare that Ukraine is joining this partnership. This partnership will have a follow-up forum in Paris in July, and of course we expect a high level of participation of Ukrainian women or Ukrainian responsible at the top level. Maybe a last word about violence against women. Here as French ambassador, I encourage Ukraine to ratify the Istanbul Convention, which is at the moment the most stringent instrument to protect women. I know there is a debate. I know also that the matter will be considered at the radar. But that would also demonstrate how Ukraine is progressing on its way to gender equality.
I absolutely agree with you, and it will be a more practical sign than joining the declaration, because it will have more consequences and to lead to more progress within the society. And here I would like to ask an ambassador of Finland to elaborate a little bit more about the way which has been chosen by Finland. And Finland is very good in a lot of scores, but I want to share with you the experience of Finland with institutions. Finland has at least 4 institutions within the government and parliament that are the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health, which prepares and implements gender equality policies and develop legislation. It's also Council for Gender Equality in the Parliament, and an ombudsman, which supervising the compliance with the Act of Equality, and you also have a special tribunal. That is quite a unique experience, and it would be good to know more. How do you evaluate the effectiveness of all these institutions?
Thank you very much, and it's a great honor to be in this panel. Still today, even if the things are going pretty well in Finland, I think that we need all these institutional bases to support gender equality. And I think that even in many colleagues have mentioned how the domestic violence against women is still a problem in our advanced countries, and I think it's a dismal thing, and that is something that we really, really have to work on. Institutions are important, but it's also very important to see that we have some practical solutions. And I'm so great that just this week we have very, very practical example of how this long work, which in Finland has been done for a century, because Finland was the first country to grant full political rights to women already in 1906. And I think what makes this quite specific is that at the time Finland was part of Russian Empire. We're not an independent country, but we could still do it. And from the beginning, it has been very important in Finland, the women's participation in the political movements and rights. And of course, we always have a friendly competition with Sweden, and I think it's very nice that we can compete also in these gender issues, but I truly admit that the good record of Finland is based on the hundreds of years Finland belonged to Sweden, and we inherited the administrative and judicial system from there, and even being 100 years part of Russian Empire, those traditions prevail, so thank you for Sweden for that. But what I was referring to is that yesterday actually, Sanna Marin was nominated the Finnish Prime Minister, and at the moment she's the youngest Prime Minister in the world at 33 years old. By the way, she took that position from Mr. Honcharuk, whom you might know also here. But apart from having a young female prime minister, all the 5 parties that are in our coalition government are led by women. And I think that this is maybe a more important sign than nominating ministers, to have the political parties led by women. And in our government we have 12 women and only 7 men. But one thing I would like to also point out when we talk about equality, because I think that it's very much also connected to the social equality and the specificity in Finland, maybe it's also in the other countries, but somehow Finnish people take some kind of pride that the people who are in power, whether they're men or women, that they don't all come from, let's say, good families or from great schools. And for example, Sanna Marin, she grew up in a rainbow family. Her father was a drunk, and she says this all openly, and I mean, it's okay. And one thing what we can conclude from this, and what is important in the social equality, but also gender equality, it's the education, and the free education for everybody. And that's where everything starts. And that's why this is very important. And also Finland is very proud to support heavily this new Ukrainian school reform in Ukraine. And that's also where we want to mainstream these gender issues, because you have to start it from the beginning.
Yes, and you are absolutely right, because education gives our children possibility to change their mental approach to each other as well, because it's also connected to families. And what do they see in families, what do they see at schools, and how it might influence their future, how they treat each other, whether or not they're equal in their understanding of each other. That's the core issue, and that's the basis for the future developments. And here I would like to ask you...
Excuse me, I have just 2 more things that if I may quickly, because actually in Finland we have come to the point where we really have to think about gender equality. It's not only women, because for example in education women are taking over, and we have to really start looking at the boys and how to support them. And this, I think, is very crucial, that it's all the genders, not only women. And that's why I'm so glad to see at least few men here, because it's so important. We need the male champions. And then we have one more asset in Finland to support our gender equality, which none of you have in this panel, and that is our language. In Finnish language, we don't have gender. We don't have he and she. We have only one. We have han. And I have been asked many times, but how come then you don't know if you're talking about men or women? But who cares? It doesn't matter.
That's really great. And I would like once to understand that in Ukraine, it doesn't matter as well. And Anka, I would like to ask you, you had an experience in Ukraine before the Revolution of Dignity, and you came back just recently. What are the differences you see in the gender approach, in the gender equality, and how do you evaluate the progress of Ukraine? And what kind of experience you had in your diplomatic service?
Thank you, Lana. Let me perhaps start with that, my experience in Ukraine. When I saw the picture of the Azarov government, I remember that I was here, and yes, there were no men, and the biggest difference really when I came back now is that you have so many more women in parliament. I see here two of the MPs who, or one has left, who joined female lunches at my flat when I was here last. We still fit around my dining table quite easily. Yeah. When I came back now, I told them, now we have to do it by subject, because there's so many female MPs or also female ministers, they won't fit around my dining table any longer, not even at a residence. So this is a good development. I have to say that I regularly tell my partners in the presidential administration that I don't see many women there, and they become quite puzzled. The other day I mentioned it, and the person said, yes, but let me remember, there must be women. And after 5 minutes he said, there's no woman. I said, yes, that's what I was telling you. But government and parliament, the progress is really, really visible, and I'm happy about that. But since all my colleagues who have spoken before me have said so many about institutional developments and progress, let me perhaps tell you a little more personal story. I lived in France from age 21 to 27, and all my French friends, female friends, started working immediately after they had children in those times again. My German classmates in those times mainly left the workforce when they became mothers. So I'm not surprised, contrary to my French colleague, that France scores much better in what you said. In Germany, and I give you just a few really bad examples, we also strive to have more women, for instance, in the boards of companies. And we have more women than ever before in the boards of companies, but there are only 8.7, I mean DAX-noted companies, 8.7%. This is really not much. And I am one of only 20 ambassadors out of 150. We blatantly miss all the goals that we set ourselves in the foreign ministry, and we have done so in the last 15 years. The goal for ambassadors, and it's not 50%, the goal for ambassadors is 22%, and we're only 12% women ambassadors. The funny thing is, I have always been puzzled why that is so, because I became a single mother at 36, and it was never a problem. I had a lot of support. The support is there. The foreign ministry has a kindergarten. We have part-time schemes. We have, I think, over 100 separate part-time schemes in the foreign ministry. It's all there, and you can use it. It's, I think, more the mental approach, because I started working when my son was 8 weeks old, so you can do it. And he's 17 now, and I think he's kind of okay. Yeah, as you said, he didn't suffer from being the son of a single mother diplomat. Why is that so that we have such bad numbers? And I think it is really still the mental problem in Germany too. And it's not so much society in terms of church, for instance, because church doesn't play the same role as it plays in other neighboring countries, and also perhaps Ukraine. It is, and Päivi mentioned that, it is, I think, politics for a big part. Even though we have had a prime minister, a female prime minister, for 14 years now, we have never had a foreign minister that was a woman, or a federal president, or a speaker of parliament. And even though we have more women as heads of political parties now, politics in Germany are still mainly a male domain. And they do the policies. And one of the things I think that is really influencing the whole setup and also prevents women from just doing what I did, meaning starting working again when the child was too small, is that our tax system, for instance, so much motivates married couples not to work, both of them. You get huge tax cuts if only one partner works. This is completely crazy. Also, when you look at our demography, we need more families with children, but there are no tax cuts specifically for families. No, there are tax cuts for married couples. This, I have the feeling, is something from 100 years ago, but it still exists, and that is a shame, but we're working on it, and I hope we will overcome it with time. And one thing that was already said is, I think, is the most important. It is inspiring examples. So this is at least what I have seen in the foreign ministry and in politics general, when there is a woman on the top, and she is doing an active effort to help women rise, then it works, and then there are more women. And I hope Ukrainian MPs and Ukrainian members of the government will also look at their role, not only as ministers or MPs, but as inspiring models.
Yeah, and we share with you the same problems, and I think that we are even less developed. We lose most of women in the middle of their careers because they have to choose, and still they have this hard choice whether to develop their careers or to take a step back and to join some companies to actually forget about their careers and just take care about the families. I don't think that they're happy, but they need to survive.
Can I add one thing which also struck me? A few years ago, Germany actually introduced, we have parental leave, and it's a big success. That's not a problem. But we introduced something that is called taking care of children money. Yeah. So instead of making the support system better, they offer money to women who do not join the workforce again. Yeah. That is the 21st century. I think the law was passed 5 years ago or so. How can that be?
And in Ukraine, in the beginning of 2000s, the situation was even worse because in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for instance, it was a constant approach that women can be only on the technical position and on the lowest position. And I also talked with Masha Ivanovich on this particular issue, and she told me that in the beginning of her career, she tried to be mannish, to wear like man, to present herself as a man, and only then she understood that world is changing and that she can act as a woman in a diplomatic service. How do you estimate changes in the diplomatic service in US?
Thank you, Lana. I would say that in the broad sweep of the last 30 or 40 years, the changes in the diplomatic service in the U.S. have been very positive. You know, in 1970, not that long ago, I was alive at that time, if you were a diplomat, a female diplomat, if you got married, you had to resign your position. You could not stay in the diplomatic service. So women in the foreign service started to talk about this, raise the understanding of it, and eventually got that rule removed. I would say, though, in the diplomatic service now, we do quite well in terms of women joining. Our process to come in the diplomatic service is very egalitarian. Everybody takes a written test, and then they take an oral test, and everyone has the same test. And whether you have connections or not, it plays no role in whether you get into the service. So we have 50% women come into the service now every year. So we have a very gender-balanced group of people who come in. The problem has been, and I think many of the panelists, particularly maybe Anka and yourself, have mentioned, The problem is, as women rise in the service, they tend to drop off more than the men. So right now, for instance, in the entire Foreign Service, 60% of the service is men and 40% is women, even though 50% of women come in. And in the top level of the Foreign Service, the very senior folks, the level I'm in, only 30% are women, 70% are men. So the question is why? And I think that you also, many people have mentioned many factors in that. It's personal choice based on perceived roles that one has to play in their family. The difficulty of moving overseas every few years presents challenges for everybody, but I would say for women perhaps even more. If their spouse or partner, for instance, is a professional and doesn't want to not work, it's harder to go overseas. If you have children with special needs, it's harder to go overseas and meet those needs. So I think that there is a societal role in the reason why we have fewer women at the top level than at the bottom level.
And what do you think can help to improve the situation?
I think the first thing to improving women's position everywhere, in every sphere, not just in the diplomatic service, is recognition of the problem. So you can legislate, you can have rules, you can have, things on the books, but if the problem isn't recognized by people and then accepted as a problem by the institution that you're in, then that problem is much harder to fix. And so I think for us in the State Department, and I think around U.S. and in corporate world as well, one of the important factors is recognition of the challenge, recognition of perhaps the barriers that are out there, and then an acceptance by those in the group that it's an important challenge to address. And in the State Department, we've actually seen quite a bit of that. There has been a very proactive way to address some of those challenges. And hopefully, in 10 years, the percentage of women at the very top will be higher.
And I heard that yesterday one of the panelists expressed his view that the main issue that women don't want actively to participate in a social life and in power. I think that that's one of the stereotypes in the society. And I do think that we need to be more loud and express our views concerning what are the obstacles for us to be more active, especially in the peace-building processes. And I absolutely agree with you, Melinda, that that's one of the crucial points where women participation is not just relevant. I think that we understand that peace processes very much depends on the policies, and that policies should include gender policy. And here I would like to pass the floor to Her Excellency Madlena Kuneva, who is the head of European Union delegation in the Council of Europe, and ask your opinion concerning the problems, what kind of issues and challenges you see, and where the Council of Europe should be more active in promoting human rights, and especially in the domain of equalities.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. Thank you to the organizers. I enjoy already second day of this excellent gathering. But let me be clear, I represent the European Union and the European Union policies to the Council of Europe. Yesterday, we had an excellent representative on the side of the Council of Europe, being able quite eloquently to underline the importance of Istanbul Convention. And in the afternoon, you gave a really hard time to your political representatives to push into the right direction. We have a lot of things in common, European Union and the Council of Europe, but of course we are different bodies. And talking about the Istanbul Convention, this is one of the bridges we would like to build further together. And I very much hope that the European Union as whole will be a collective member of the Istanbul Convention. We have one feature with which we are very strong, the European Union, and that we put in before a lot of our policies, the adjective common, common European policy. And I am so much proud of this panel, and I would like to especially to say thank you to the EU ambassadors, because they made quite clear why the European Union is in lead of this process, I would dare to say, worldwide, because of humbleness. Because I think what the Swedish ambassador mentioned, what the Finnish ambassador mentioned, the surprise of my French colleague, really, are we so ahead? I thought that we are still lagging behind. This is remarkable. Because believe me, there is no winners forever, and there is no losers forever. Everything is possible if you have a good will. If you maintain this inspiration, which is part of your slogan, and if you keep one absolutely indispensable ingredient for your political future, hope. Why the Union is the best place, from my point of view, to go further, to make a leap, I wish, further? Because we compare with each other. Because we know that Sweden is the best. But we also, all the time as EU ambassador, I coordinate all 28 countries, and all of them, all of us, we are humble at certain points, saying, okay, maybe this is one area where we are doing great, but there are certain areas where we are not doing so great. Malta, recently, after the assassination of the journalist, and all the public riots and support to getting the things right, it is a European country. Years ago, Ireland had been rejected to her credentials to be accepted at the Council of Europe, because Council of Europe said, you don't have enough women representation in your delegation to Parliamentary Assembly, and we stop you. And they stopped Ireland. And Ireland at the end corrected, and you know, it's a perfectly well developed in respect of women's rights behavior and introducing policies.
Cold showers are always very useful.
Indeed. What we can do more and better together. You are already really ahead of a curve because you recognize the problem and because you have caucuses. And because you are eager to listen, to understand, and to develop policies. May I offer you one sentence from Jacques Monnet, one of the founders of the European Union. I love this phrase. He said, nothing could start without personalities, but nothing could last without institutions. Please take care for both. Imagine you need leaders. Yesterday there was a question, what does it mean to be a leader? I have my answer I'd like to offer you. You can measure your leadership by the number of people you've been able to influence. Changes of life through your personal input. Might be one, but big one. Might be plenty, and this one will make the world better for these people. That's what we would like to support from the point of view of the European Union. Policies through which we can empower. That's what it means to empower. To make the things better around you. You don't have a luxury to pick up only one topic. Let's say Istanbul Convention, really very, very important. But if you'd like to go ahead, you need to have the whole complexity. Why women are not going to work? Compare the salaries. If the man in the family, the husband, the partner, has a higher salary and the family with 4 or 3 members needs to waive, I believe that the bigger salary will be chosen, and this is the reason. So equal payment is not just a nice word. Equal payment is everyday life. We have a plan which I'd like to offer you, just 5 points on the side of the European Union, and we have 5 areas of engagement with regard to promotion of gender equality. So first is economic independence. Second is equal pay for work of equal value. Third is equality in decision making. Fourth, ending gender-biased violence. And the final one is the promotion of gender equality beyond the European Union. We are about to start with you working on the association agreement, the next one. You need data indeed, and you need to make this as one of the gears for the next years. We are still as a continent, as a world important policy, we are still not there. And this recognition of the fact is very important.
I absolutely share your opinion, and with this powerful intervention, I would like to open the floor to the questions, because I'm more than sure that there are a number of questions from the participants from the audience. And the floor is yours. Okay, the lady on.
Thank you, colleagues. My name is Evgenia Filipenko. I'm Director for International Organizations in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. And I would like to thank...
And one of the very bright women in the ministry.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I wanted to thank you in the first place for drawing attention to the situation in the Foreign Ministry related to gender equality. In order to improve the situation, which is not inspiring, our minister committed to conduct a gender equality audit. And thanks to the UN Women, we have conducted this gender audit in the Foreign Ministry. It's almost completed. We hope that the results of the audit will help to improve the situation. During the audit, we looked not only into the numbers, but we also looked into a range of other factors of institutional, social, economic characters which are needed to provide equal opportunities for men and women in the diplomatic service to effectively do their job as diplomats. So I think, MFA became the first ministry in Ukraine to conduct such an audit. We hope we set a good example, and that the outcome of the audit will help really to improve the situation.
And I really hope that such definition as women countries will be left in the past of our ministry.
Thank you. It was more of a comment, but less than a question, but maybe I could ask our panelists if they could share their experience of the gender audits in their diplomatic services. We know that France has conducted such an audit, and also Ireland, and your experience would be also very helpful to us. Thank you.
Colleagues, friends, Ambassador?
Yes, thank you. That's a very good practice, and I could just encourage Ukraine to follow this path. In France, we have conducted many audits, in particular in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. There is a very active association of women diplomats in the French ministry, and we have also labeled the embassy from a gender equality point of view, and I'm pleased that the French embassy in Ukraine has been labeled as, I would not say women-friendly, but at least as respecting the gender equality requirements.
Thank you. European External Action Service is relatively new. We have European External Action Service as a body since 2009, the Lisbon Treaty. But we already have a task force which is entirely dedicated to women participation. And we have regular reviews, and it's important to have benchmarks and then to follow how these benchmarks are implemented. It helps.
Thanks. So the UK ran a civil service-wide gender audit. I think their first one was about 4 or 5 years ago, and that was the first one that forensically broke down the representation of women at grades across the civil service, and it actually mirrors the experience of the US very closely, and was really influential in policies that were then brought in, and incentives that were brought in to help women to make choices to remain in their careers mid-career or at the beginning. But it also did one other thing, which I don't think we've really touched on that much yet, which is that it highlighted values and behaviours. and how women take decisions about building their careers relative to values in the civil service and behaviours exhibited by their colleagues. For that reason, a second process happened. It's taken a while to get to define it because it's inevitably quite a sensitive thing, which is around harassment, and the first ever surveys department by department of who is experiencing harassment and what kind have been taking place over the last 2 years, to see if parallels can be drawn between that and some of the decisions that women take about where and how they want to leave, that are not just about carer responsibilities, but just about their experience in the workplace.
Anka?
Yeah, perhaps let me reinforce the point I already made. We have all these audits and structures, really, we have that. But it somehow obviously misses the point, because we created a women's network around 10 years ago, and we were the first ones to flag out to the ministry that the political department of our embassy in Washington didn't have, and it's a big political department, didn't have one single woman. No. And we asked the ambassador, and he said, oh, I hadn't noticed. And that was so typical, because that is how careers were made. They were made by networks, and the networks started in these important embassies, in important departments, and from there on, and it was never flagged out by audits, it was just our own interior statistics. So we started with that, and this informal group of women has really achieved quite a lot, and now we have the first female head of the cabinet of our minister, and she still goes around looking for women to promote them, to put them in the right, important, visible places in order to create role models.
But you don't have any official union of women in order to protect rights or something like that?
We have all that. We have an ombudsman. Rebecca Harms is here. She can tell you that. We have all the structures. They didn't work for a very long time.
So do we have... Yes, please, Rebecca.
So I would like to recall what Peter Wagner yesterday said on a panel discussion here in the conference. He said that since we have now a female Commission's president, for the first time in the history of the European Union, a lot of things will change. And Ursula von der Leyen made it already a rule that representatives of the European Commission will not participate in conferences and panels where there is no gender equality, no gender balance. So you need women in leading position. You need the women to make it through through this hidden ceiling to change really the rules. And I really, really hope that these new ideas stemming from the first decisions of Mrs. von der Leyen, that these new rules, this new code of conduct will help women in in a lot of different fields to make it through and to make it to the international conferences, to speak on the panels, because this will be the real way to change. And for the External Action Service, I think it's very good that in the European Union we had Catherine Ashton and Federica Mogherini leading the External Action Service in the making. It changed a lot.
May I add something?
Yes, please.
Just to add a few words. Ursula von der Leyen, for the first time, President of the European Commission, is female, but also European Central Bank, Christine Lagarde. There was a great photo recently, perfectly gender balanced, President of the European Council and President of the Parliament, 2 men, and 2 women, President of the European Commission and President of ECB. Also, we have Secretary General of the European External Action Service, also a very strong female. So things are moving in the right direction. But this is for the first time.
Yes, please.
Uliana Safrun, I was acting Minister of Health in Ukraine, and I wanted to ask a question about You said that over 40% of the women who were in government in the UK were victims of hate speech. I was wondering if there was something that you could tell us, give us advice in Ukraine, because I think most of the women who are here who've worked in government can agree with me that a lot of women don't want to go into government positions and into public positions because of the difficulties in how they're treated and what is said about them. And for them, it's actual personal attacks. It's about personal attacks that they're not sitting home with their families, or personal attacks on their appearance, or personal attacks on you're just a woman, you don't have anything to say. And is there something that you can give us advice for us, those of us who want to continue being active publicly, on how we can either gather together to help one another, and what sort of legislation can be put in place so that that sort of hate speech is punished?
And what kind of particular topics we can introduce in order not to let anybody to have hate speech towards any kind of person, I think. It's not about women.
So thank you. So the statistic I was referring to was the research that showed that over 70% of hate speech that had been directed towards UK parliamentarians was directed towards female parliamentarians. So in other words, female parliamentarians were experiencing the brunt of it. And if I'm honest, I think this is something we're still all learning about, because this relates to the foggy world of social media and what's prosecutable and what's not, and what constitutes hate speech and what doesn't. And we've all of us, I think, there is none of us who has not been really slow to appreciate and legislate for the fact that what is said in social media is just as defamatory and should be just as prosecutable as what is said to your face. And there are slowly court cases, and there are dismissals, and there are disciplinaries which are beginning to indicate that if you put something up on Twitter against someone else, you may not actually get away with it. But we are, I still think, painfully slow to use our institutions and use our processes to enforce that. Therefore, this issue of support, mutual support, becomes the most important thing. And that was why I was making this point earlier. I am frankly astonished that so few female parliamentarians have left politics, given what they face daily, because it can be relentless. And when I talk to some of them, and interestingly, so you'll know we have a general election tomorrow, and one of them, Luciana Berger, is a candidate in my own constituency. And I was in London last week, and she was canvassing where I lived, and I ran into her, literally in the high street. So I asked her, how come you're still in it? Where are you getting your energy? Where are you getting your nerve to decide that it is worthwhile you spending your life in public service dealing with this daily stuff? And Luciana Berger is one of those who's experienced this on several levels, not just as a female parliamentarian, not just as a new mother, also as a Jew. This has been a multi-level harassment for her. And she talked about several things that I think are important for everyone. So one is the way in which she conserves her perspective. This may be a very banal thing, but it's a core thing for her, that when you jump into social media, it feels like a world that swirls around you. But actually, it's happening over there, and you can step back from it, and your personal support system is what helps you to do that. So this speaks to work-life balance. The other is the institutional support. It means everything to her that fellow MPs, male and female, Labour or Conservative or Green Party or SNP, it doesn't matter, step in and tell other people that what is being said to her is unacceptable. And it matters similarly that parliamentary institutions take people to task. So there is the informal and the formal, and you require both. And these things tell her, she says that these things give her heart, actually, both that our institutions are strong, but that people in real life are more minded to support those who want to give their career for public service. And that is what helps her to keep going. But I believe that the strength here is the combination. It needs all of them. And it isn't just women banding together to talk about abuse against women. It's women and men. It's male parliamentarians and female parliamentarians, with the institutions backing them up.
So one more question.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ines Ofsona. I'm a member of parliament from Hollis Party. I have a question to you which refers to the discussion that we were having in the similar panel yesterday, which was about gender issues and education. And you have already mentioned shortly about that. And before I proceed to my question, I will shortly mention one of the issues that were discussed yesterday. There was a course that was introduced in some of the Ukrainian schools, which is called the Basics of Family Life. And the course is, let's to say, very conservative. One of the issues that is mentioned in the course is that women never fight, women never argue, which I like particularly, or that women are the primary caretaker in the family and that they should pray for the fathers in the family. Those are some of the quotes in this highly conservative course. And the Ministry of Education has already said that they will, reconsider whether this course is supposed to be taught in schools overall. But there is a huge discussion about this course and in general about how do we teach gender non-discriminatory policy in schools. And the big debate is, well, first of all, within the society, but then there are particular groups in the society that are particularly active in terms of introducing a very conservative approach to that, let's put it mildly, and particularly the religious organizations. So my first question to you is how do you organize a dialogue that is, on the one hand, respectful towards the rights of the different groups, particularly the religious groups? And my second question does not refer to the organization of the debate, but more in general, what is the experience of your countries in terms of providing some gender expertise of the educational curriculum, and whether some of that expertise can be used and transferred here to the Ukrainian context?
Can I
Thank you.
address the first question to Bartosz, and the second to Ambassador of Finland?
Well, if you are right in describing this course, I believe it's simply ridiculous. It has nothing to do with conservatism. We have, in Polish schools, we also have kind of preparation for a family life, but I'm afraid I'm not able to share the details. Generally, there is discussion in Poland whether this on the division of work between the family and the school. And there are those who believe that actually preparing for life in a family is on the parents. And school is to teach you languages, biology, etc., etc. Probably there is some balance, and probably to some extent school is also should be responsible for cultural formation of a person, of a student. So yeah, this is, I don't find, if this is really what happens in Ukrainian schools, I think
I think that
deserves
we still have a
reflection.
kind of Soviet legacy in our school, and in approach to education and issues related to the equal rights. We still need to think more about inclusivity and to work with families, because this has roots in the families. And also our teachers are a part of our societies. We need to pay more attention to their education, to their development of skills, and to the explanations. And I pass the floor to Finland.
Thank you. I think the word here is also this mainstreaming, which means that you start to discuss all aspects of life on a fact-based basis with very early on with children. And I mean, this comes, when you talk about different genders, when you talk about sexual education, when you talk about maturing, when you talk about the relations between women and men. I mean, you have to just start it very honestly and very early on, without sort of like ideology. And I think that the conservative church group should teach in their churches and not at school.
And I think that the main ideology should be the equal rights to everybody and equal treatment. And I want with this to conclude this panel and to make some focuses of our attention, of our discussion here. Definitely, Ukraine has a lot to do in order to develop equal rights and equal opportunities to everybody. And I do think that the first step we should make, that's definitely the ratification of Istanbul Convention. That's one of the crucial points. The second one is, of course, related to our future. We need to be very stable in our choices and to promote these equal rights and opportunities in the next phase of association agreement. And I do think that European Union policies and practices should help us to build institutions and to change our mentality. And I also think that we need to change our approaches into budgeting and to help women to proceed with their career and to give them opportunities to act. And with this, I support all leaders in this room to promote these ideas and to bring them further in the society. And I thank all the panelists for their participation and for the opportunity to be here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for all participants for this interesting discussion. And so we would kindly ask you to stay at your places because we're going to